In this season, we strive to bring you stories that decenter history.
History resonates differently with different people. Through sharing these personal stories, both from our guests and the people they talk about,
we want to challenge the dominant narratives that focus on single strands and one-dimensional stories.
Join us for Season 2 of Who This Podcast.
Season 2 is here to redefine the way we understand our past.
Because the past really happened, and history is just what somebody wrote down.
Hi everyone, I'm Nomita. When life gives you limestones, build a palace. Or at least I know one guy who did. Today we're going to talk about Joseph Ferdinand Cheval, a Frenchman, an extraordinary tale of just an ordinary postman from France. He is from Naïve, a southeastern village in France, born in 1836. As a young man, he worked as a baker and then went on to be a postman, a mail carrier in his village. And also at the very ripe young age of 22, he married his first wife, Roselyne Revol, with whom he had 2 sons. Cheval's story is interesting and also tragic in the way that he experienced a great deal of loss in his life with the deaths of his wife and his children. After his first wife died in 1878, he met and married Claire Philomene Richaud, who was his second wife, with whom he had a daughter, Alice Marie, who also died 15 years later. And this was a point in his life, I think, where he came a bit undone with the grief that he experienced. And it makes for a very interesting turning point in this man's life and what led him to create the way he did.
Okay, nice. So what happened?
In 1879, Cheval was just walking home on his route from having delivered mail, I suppose, in Naïve. He tripped over an oddly shaped stone, which he thought was very intriguing. And as a young man, he had always dreamed of building something. And for whatever reason, this incident of tripping over a particular rock just sort of reignited that passion of wanting to create something with this oddly shaped rock. He then set out to start building a palace of his own, which he then went to call Le Palais Idéal. He built this for 33 years, day in, after his work as a regular mail carrier. Every night he would pick up stones he would go back to the same place that he found that original strange looking rock, found that there were many more things that sort of inspired him from the nature around, and started just piling rocks into his pockets and started taking it to place and started building a palace for himself, often in the night, often in candlelight. It was also the 1800s, so there was not a lot of technology to aid him in this endeavor of his. And so he continued to do this with no real sort of goal apart from just building something for himself. He said it was a dream of his and a place, I suppose, for his imagination and creativity to sort of play out. And if you take a look at his palace, if you see pictures of it, it's really interesting in the style that it depicts, in that it has all kinds of styles. And I think that's what makes it really interesting, because it has influences from things that you would see from all around the world. It has similar bearings and markings of architecture that you would find in a lot of Christian religion, Hindu religion, in Islamic architecture, for instance. And what I found very intriguing about his story is that this man had never left France and somehow also brought to life in his art worlds that are so far away from his own. He drew inspiration, they say, from having just seen postcards that he was delivering to people across the village. And from the art and the pictures that he saw on the postcards, he managed to build a world entirely from his mind and make it a reality. And I really encourage people to look at pictures of Palais Ideal because the facade is absolutely stunning and also intriguing because I've never been to Naïve, but I saw videos and pictures of this place and it just looks really interesting because it reminded me also a lot of architecture that you would see in, let's say, an Indian Hindu temple. Some of it looks a little bit reminiscent of like Angkor Wat or things like that. And certain parts of the facade also, he made it look like a church and a temple and also a mosque. And then he started etching quotes all across the facade, sort of implying what it meant to him. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting that he managed to do so without ever having left his village.
Yeah, and one of the things I find very very interesting is the fact that like he not only did he never leave his village, he was never trained in any of this. He had no formal education, so it must have been like, learning as he goes along, putting things together, and then becoming such a genius at it by the end that you can look at this facade and know that this is art. Like, that this is dedication. And the fact that he drew from the world around him. He drew from nature and he drew from, as a postman, the postcards that he's seen all over the world, and that he let that inspire him. And it's funny because he probably never saw the scale of all of these things and how big they were. They were on like postcards, which might have said something about the way he built his palace because it wasn't like an enormous structure. It was a very petite structure, but a very intricate and precise way of building, which is magnificent for me to know that a man from a farm village who was a mailman and probably a little bit of a baker, so he probably knew how to let things stick. There's ways in where you bake things and where you know how to this is the formula, this is the ingredient to let things look a certain way or feel a certain way or stay together a certain way. And then all of these things coming together to create this beautiful work of art.
I mean, it's fascinating. Just the idea alone that he had this epiphany potentially because of a fall on a on a rock that seemed interesting to him, and then this obsession that came about it, right? Like and people known later down the line for creating something beautiful or something special, they become completely obsessed with that one thing. Building a palace for 33 years is dedication, and he was still working at the time, right?
Yeah, he continued to work as a mail carrier to support his family, and he did this sort of in the evenings and the weekends and things like that. So as I mentioned, he began by just collecting rocks that he could physically carry himself by his hand in his pockets, and at some point, I suppose when the structure started really taking shape, he began using a wheelbarrow to sort of take all the rocks that he found interesting and just sort of stood out to him, I suppose. I think it's interesting then that you mentioned that he doesn't have any formal training, right? He was not an artist by any measure before he started. He was just another man going about his life when he decided that I'm going to build a palace. And he built something with his hand for 33 years. He also had a lot of respect for the tools that he used, which I thought was also very fascinating. There are certain parts of that structure that are dedicated just to honoring the tools that he used. The wheelbarrow that he used, for instance, is in one part of the palace. And he put a little quote on the wheelbarrow, which basically read, "My companion in suffering," because it was something that he used for 33 years to drag up these rocks and build it by hand. And he did that with a lot of other tools as well. And I think there was something very touching about how respectful he was about his tools. And just a man
that
by
was
himself.
basically his Wilson in the...
Yeah. Yeah.
But that touches upon something, right? Because he was a relatively lonely person at that point in his life because of all the loss that he endured, because his first wife passed away relatively soon, right?
Yeah.
And then the dowry from his second wife gave him the plot of land
that he
could build the palace on. But she also passed away.
Yeah, she did.
And how many kids also passed away?
All of his kids.
All of his kids passed away.
It's absolutely tragic. He had
after
two
or
sons.
before he started building the palace, or during, I assume, if it's
so he had 3 children.
Right.
His first son died a year, I believe, after he was born. And his second son was still alive when he started building the palace. And his only daughter from his second wife, she died when she was 15, which was a few years after he started. I believe 4 years after he started.
Right.
That's rough.
Yeah, so it's his way also of finding solace in this project, which adds the extra element of, yes, it's an obsession and he has a commitment to this inspiration that he found, but I think it's also, a way to cope with life and a way to kind of take control and form for himself something out of nothing. I feel like that's also, it's inspiring in a very saddening way, but still inspiring, I think.
Yeah.
You can imagine the helplessness he must have felt, because when he started, he already lost one child and he lost his first wife. And that's when he started building. And it occurs to me that the psychology must have been, everything is transient. Everything is moving into nothingness. And he wanted to build something as he goes along that will stay, that is durable, reliable, that will be there, and that will be beautiful and an honor, as he says. He's honoring his tool, but he's also honoring his struggle and his pain. It comes up in a lot of the quotes that he puts in the building, quotes of struggle and suffering and imagination. Like, that's something that he thinks he can control, but the rest of it, life, loss, that he can't control. And so it feels like this is his way of finding some kind of grounding and something solid, something that he himself has control over. And you can imagine like him watching his 1-year-old die, or the wife that he loves, his first wife, so much. And then in the middle of that, then lose the second wife, and then lose his son, and then lose his daughter. And then it's just like, this is the only thing that stays until the end. Until even after that, he went on to build his own resting place. That's how much he wanted to control the sense of death and suffering. I guess that's where my mind goes to when I think of this man's story.
Yeah, it took him 8 years to build his own mausoleum, which is very, I was trying to imagine what that would mean for myself to build a spot for me, knowing that that is my spot to pass away or to be in after I pass away. It's a sort of embracement of death that I find, for me, it's an uncomfortable thought. I understand very much that me and this man are in very different headspaces. But I do find it intriguing in a sort of, let's say that he took control of his life through building this palace, and then in whatever way he could, he also added a little bit of control over his death. You know what I mean? It's just...
What do we know about that? Sort of the idea that he wanted to build his own mausoleum. Is there anything known other that he actually did it?
The mausoleum still exists, and that is where he rests right now, but not so much about why, I suppose. He just wanted to build his own mausoleum, and at the time, with his second wife, I believe, and that was illegal in France. You couldn't just do that. So he just said, okay, I'm going to do it myself outside. And then he chose to build it himself. A lot of what we spoke about just now had a lot to do with the tragic loss of his loved ones and how that probably drove him, and it did. The loss of his daughter particularly apparently drove a lot of his art in the later years. I do see a more beautiful side to this, also because of the quotes that he ingrained into his, he sort of put into his palace. As troubling and saddening as his life story is, this place that he built literally is where he gave birth to his dreams, and he even writes it in, again, excuse my French pronunciation, but he put a quote on there which reads, "Où le songe devient la réalité," which is where dreams come to reality. And I think that's exactly what this place is. He built it just from a thought and dreams that he had, and he never let that go. And there's something, and maybe that was the grounding factor, right? Through all of the loss that he faced in his life, that he never let go of that dream that he's going to build this place. And I think there's something incredibly beautiful about that. Yeah, I found that very fascinating.
Which I think is really interesting, because if you think about that, then he probably, beyond the imagination of him building that structure and bringing in all those elements of the things that he's seen on the postcards, etc., he probably also pictured this world that he created more than the structures that were there.
Yeah.
And it was his escapism from the harsh reality that he was facing.
Like a refuge, just sort
Like
of.
a refuge, yeah. And I think a lot of people have that also nowadays,
course,
right? Like there's an escape to the harshness that is in the world as well.
We build worlds in our own head, I think, to escape reality. Our man just did it literally and built a whole palace that you can actually visit. So,
but it's also a bit of self-actualization, right? Because these are also his dreams to make something. Evidently, like he wanted to, or he didn't just want to, he made his imagination into reality, and he left a lasting legacy, and he did something that very evidently loved doing as much as baggage and emotion and everything that went into it. He just loved doing this, and he spent his life doing what he loved, and that's and I find that it's to me, it's escapism, but like a very healthy way of escapism, because he propelled himself to self-actualize to a certain extent, I think.
Yeah, it's such a testimony to his mind, if nothing else, that you can literally see a physical representation of his thoughts, his aspirations, what he sort of viewed and perceived as beautiful or anything like that. He literally gave it shape, and I think that is quite stunning. Again, because it comes back to this point that we discussed before, he had absolutely no training whatsoever in art. Forget training, he just had never expressed any inclination, or had he undertaken any activity that would even put him anywhere in that sphere. And yet he managed to build something, which I think is pretty darn impressive.
As a guy, I do get how satisfying it is to find a nice rock. You ever see like a nice stick or a nice rock and you're like, that's a good.
Can I just say, I don't think that's just a guy thing, because as a child, I picked up a lot of sticks and rocks that I thought were just, at some point I had to get rid of them because my mom thought it was getting a little ridiculous how much my collection was growing. But yeah. And you can see the original rock that he stumbled upon as well. It is quite fascinating.
So what happened do we know more about his life? Like, was there, like, we know that he built this structure. Do we know whether people judged him for that, or like frowned upon that building of this massive palace?
Yeah, they did. I think it was, we're talking about this in, of course, in hindsight, that, he built this amazing structure that it looks beautiful and it's gorgeous, but imagine setting out to do this in the first, say, weeks, months, and then it just looks like
pile of rocks.
Yeah, exactly. A child just putting together a pile of rocks, and it doesn't. And also imagine putting the hours, like every day, just doing this, day after day, just putting things together, and it makes no sense to anyone. And apparently, he was ridiculed in his village that, this man's just a bit off his rockers, I suppose, not knowing, why he's doing this.
The story was this guy fell and he hit his head.
Yeah.
He fell over a rock and he hit his head.
Yeah,
and he lost his mind.
So nothing about this story sounds like, he's going to continue to build this for the next 3 decades and it's going to turn out absolutely gorgeous and something that is going to be then regarded as a cultural monument. So he was ridiculed. And I think, although there's a fair bit about his life that is out there and that he wrote himself as well, but you can make this conclusion even from his own words. Like I said, he's put quotes all over his palace, and as I read his quotes, and there's so many of them, some of it his own, some of it that he borrowed from other artists, this man definitely comes across as someone who had a bit of a chip on his shoulder in the best ways, because of course he went on to do something incredible, but because he writes somewhere that this is the work of a singular man. And one other quote, if I may, he says, by creating this rock, I wanted to prove what willpower is capable of. He is very driven, and it's so evident that nothing was going to stop him. And I don't think any amount of ridicule that he faced clearly did not stop him. And I think that was pretty badass, if I may. Yeah.
Do you know if, and this is not like, let's say, I don't think he sought recognition from, the art elite or anything, but do you know if towards the end of his life, if there was that recognition anyway, did France or someone else recognize his work while he was still alive, or was it post-mortem that it became a monument or a statement?
In 1969, André Malraux, the Minister of Culture in France, then recognized it, declared it a cultural landmark. So it did take some time. It was not during his lifetime, even though fairly early on, there were other artists who recognized it for sort of the genius that it was, including artists like Picasso and Max Ernst and things like that. But it did take some time before people thought more of it than just some man-child's palace, I suppose.
And can I ask you, so why this story? Why do you bring this story to us, and how do you feel about it?
This man was very recently introduced to me, and I just happened to look him up out of curiosity. And this, again, goes back to what we discussed at the start about the sort of naive approach to his art, which is apparently a form of art, naive art. It's very whimsical and innocent in approach, which I think Palais Dial sort of epitomizes that. There is no bounds to his imagination or creativity. And that spoke to me because as a child, I spent many hours just playing either by myself or with friends of mine. And we spent hours building worlds and making up stories and building forts or things like that. And I genuinely remember it being such and really, I don't know. It was just a time in my life where absolutely nothing could bring us down. We were able to entertain ourselves for hours just building this kind of world in our head. And we were doing that with just, whatever we could find around us. And I think this guy literally went out and built a palace of that sort where it's just his imagination and creativity boundlessly finding, space, finding a reality. And that I thought was really beautiful.
It's just human at the end, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what about him inspired you? What made you connect to him at first?
I looked him up just because my friend told me about him. And then the more I read about his story, the more I became intrigued with this man who is from sort of middle of nowhere France, had never seen much of the world, but built this structure. And we've spoken about this before, about how his art form is, what you would classify as naive art. The fact that there's an innocent, childlike approach to it, in that he didn't know too much about art, he had no exposure to it, and yet somehow he managed to create something so magical. And I think this, for me, epitomizes that kind of art, because he just went there and let his imagination run wild, and it found reality in the external world. And that was something that was very interesting to me. And it also connected with me because I'm a single child. I spent a lot of time just playing by myself with me and my dog and maybe a friend every now and then. So I spent a lot of, afternoons and the weekends playing by myself and building worlds in my head, fun places that me and my doggy would just, sort of exist in. And it was born out of necessity at the time, and not in a sad way. It was just absolutely fun. It was great to build these worlds in my head and play with it. But this man actually did that. He built a world that we now see and can actually visit. So that I found really interesting as well. I presume that if I even had an ounce of artistic inclination, and if I could build a world, it would be something like that, something marvelous and something, where there's no bound to your creativity. So I found that really, really interesting. And another part was, because we mentioned this before, he'd never traveled the world, and yet he drew inspiration from all across the world. And I saw some pictures initially of this palace, and I mentioned some parts look like some temples that I've even been to in India. And I found that really fascinating. This man's never stepped foot outside of France and somehow is able to bring to life places that he's never traversed. And again, maybe a leap. I think in this day and age, there's a lot of stock put into being well-traveled and cultured and seeing the world. And not everyone has the access to that. It's also a bit of a privilege being able to go outside and see different parts of the world. And I think it's really sweet and fascinating that he managed to do just that, but just with his mind, just from drawing inspiration, like we mentioned, from the postcards. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, it's very human at the end, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And also it makes you feel connected to him
Yeah.
in that way of, childlike wonder, but also
Mm-hmm.
because I saw it as well, and like culturally there was definitely some Indian stuff that I think you recognize. There was some more Spanish and Moroccan, or like,
Yeah.
Iberian architecture of like Moorish is the word I'm looking for, that I also recognize. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh,
He's
I
like in the
connect
Gaudi,
with his imagination because he connected with places that I know, and I also connect with his imagination because
Mm-hmm.
I was a kid and I dreamt a lot like he manifested his dreams.
Yeah. And I think that was super just interesting because I spent a lot of my childhood also just reading and being read to as well about places that I'd never visited, never seen. And it was 90s India. There was not a whole lot of exposure to it. We were just sort of opening up to the world, and it was super. Yeah. So there were a lot of places that I could think of in my head because I read a lot of British authors, like childhood, children's books and things like that. So the kind of landscape that was being sort of described to me is, I don't know, the moors of Scotland or some sort of English countryside. I have no clue. I'd never been to that until like decades later. And I could still think of all of that because of the worlds it was creating in my head. And all of that was simply from stories. And I suppose for him, it was something like that. He's seeing all these beautiful places on postcards that he's delivering, never been there. But instead of just traveling, like I said, in his head, he sought to just be able to see it every day and, I don't know, climb up and down it, I suppose. So that was really cool.
One of his quotes I want to just like bring to the fore. 1879 to 1912. 10,000 days. 93,000 hours. 33 years of struggle. Let those who think they can do better try.
Wow.
Words to live by. Well, maybe not the 33 years, but then the last few words, I think, and the hours, but yeah. So what's in your mind palace, and what would that look like? Thank you so much for listening, and catch us wherever you get your podcast fix.